Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Elite Chairs of Christ and I teach theology. This is a podcast on the Star Quest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 338 and we're covering Gaudium et Spes 58, and the topic is cultural subordinate to the integral perfection of the person. So culture needs to serve the person. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we spoke about how the culture can be enculturated and can transform culture for the good. Today, we are going to continue Chapter 2, the proper development of culture. We are going to conclude Section 2, some principles for the proper development of culture. We'll start Section 3 tomorrow. And the topic for today is culture at the service of good of society's individuals, and culture should be free to develop. Paragraph 59, which is our topic today, has 5 subparagraphs, and we'll read them in 3 sections. A talks about the need to develop contemplative faculties. B and C talks about how culture flows from our spiritual nature, and science can use its own principles. D and E talk about how man can search for the truth in culture, and government should not impose one culture. Let's begin with A. For the above reasons, the Church recalls to the mind of all that culture is to be subordinated to the integral perfection of the human person, to the good of the community and to the whole of society. Therefore, it is necessary to develop the human faculties in such a way that there results a growth of the faculty of admiration, of intuition, of contemplation, of making personal judgment, of developing a religious, moral, and social sense. This paragraph begins by reminding us that culture is set to seek the integral good of the person. And so, culture is not an end in itself, it is a means for the good of man. And this good is not just individual good, but also societal good. Culture can do so much good for society, not just for individuals. Now, it does do good for individuals as well, but for both. And so what do we do? Well, how do we respond? Well, we want culture to develop certain faculties or certain areas of knowledge or kind of ways of approaching things. And the end of this subparagraph lists a whole bunch. The idea of all these is to see and appreciate and act in accord with the good. Admiration, how do we look at the good? Intuition, how do we appropriate the good into ourselves? Contemplation, how do we look at the good in a kind of contemplative, awe-inspiring way? Making personal judgment, making the judgment of the good. And then developing a religious, moral, and social sense. These all relate back to seeing what is good and acting in accord with the good. 59, B and C talk about how culture flows from our spiritual nature. B and then C, science can use its own principles. B, culture, because it flows immediately from the spiritual and social character of man, has constant need of a just liberty in order to develop. It needs also the legitimate possibility of exercising its autonomy according to its own principles. It therefore rightly demands respect and enjoys a certain inviolability within the limits of the common good, as long, of course, as it preserves the right of the individual and of the community, whether particular or universal. C. This sacred synod, therefore, recalling the teaching of the First Vatican Council, declares there are 2 orders of knowledge, which are distinct, namely faith and reason. And the Church will not forbid that the human arts and disciplines use their own principles and their proper method, each in its own domain. Therefore, acknowledging this just liberty, the Sacred Synod affirms the legitimate autonomy of human culture and especially of the sciences. 59b here is really talking about our spiritual nature. And culture involves our spiritual nature, even if it's not a specifically spiritual aspect of culture, as we can think of, like, contemplating God, seeing the kind of divine or some kind of higher power. Even if you look at something like a love song, And almost every single culture in the world has some kind of love song of some form, or some kind of romantic aspect. That is involving our spiritual dimension, because our spiritual dimension is that which is not physical. And human love, even in the romantic type, leading to hopefully matrimony and lifelong commitment, is something that's spiritual, something that goes beyond the physical. It's not just, I want to have sexual relations with you. Animals are like that. Humans have a love that goes beyond that. And even if this love song does not refer to something divine or something of a higher power, we see something of the spiritual nature there. And that's important that we see that. And so culture should be free to develop because our spiritual nature is free. And each person is inviolable. Moving on to D, it talks about how we have both faith and reason. It notes, first of all, that in Vatican I, about 100 years before Vatican II, there was a whole discussion, a whole document called De Filius. If you want to get into this in depth, it talks about it extensively. And De Filius really talks about this idea of faith and reason and what we can know about God from reason alone. That we can know God exists, that we know He's a creator. And John Paul II develops this later in Fides et Ratio, which is in the 1990s. The exact year is escaping me. I didn't write it down before I started recording. And reason here can work on its own. Some things like math and physical science have their own rules. How are the rules for genetics? How do I determine this gene or that? Well, there's a certain freedom, a certain autonomy of that from spiritual, physical, philosophical discussion. And so it is proper for science to maintain a degree of autonomy like this. We're not saying that science is completely independent of spiritual, independent of ethics or things like that, but science has a certain degree of autonomy. Moving on to our last reading part today, D and E talk about men can search for the truth in culture and government should not impose one culture. 59D. All this supposes that, within the limits of morality and the common utility, man can freely search for the truth, express his opinion, and publish it. That he can practice any art he chooses, and finally, he can avail himself of true information concerning events of a public nature. E. As for the public authority, it is not its function to determine the character of the civilization, but rather to establish the conditions and to use the means which are capable of fostering the life of culture among all, even within the minorities of a nation. It is necessary to do everything possible to prevent culture from being turned away from its proper end and made to serve as an instrument of political or economic power. So, 59D here is talking about how man can freely seek the truth and can freely publish it. And we want there to be a sense of truth in the public domain where we can go and read a newspaper and find out, what this politician said, or, and we'll find out that there's these commentators that they're like, this politician's the best, and there's other commentators who think this politician's the worst. It's good to have that public debate in society. But here, the church also notes there are limits of morality. For example, the state can restrict certain types of pornography or all pornographic type material, and it can also restrict who has access to it. We don't want children to have access to anything pornographic or things like that. And also, we don't seek truth by seeking it through violence or through theft or other crimes. And then E talks about how public authority needs to set the ground for each to seek the truth well. But at the same time, it's not supposed to impose a specific culture. It builds these conditions for development of culture. It builds the conditions for all these different people to develop their own culture, to develop it for the good. But it doesn't impose this or that specific culture. This is strongly against the kind of communism of the time, but also against certain kind of totalitarian governments in today who want to impose a certain culture. And it notes here it's important to respect minority cultures. And governments can put certain restrictions on it to prevent culture from going too far astray, going away from the truth, without imposing it. Obviously, the rules set out here for government are a bit of a balancing act and need a bit of prudence, a bit of tightrope walking, because the church is not, kind of gives things that are general but have kind of a tension or opposition. They're not directly in contradiction, but they have that degree where you need a lot of prudence and balance to figure it out best. And that goes well beyond what we're covering here in this podcast. So thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we'll continue with the next paragraphs in Gaudium Spes. That will be paragraphs 60 to 61 on education and synthesis. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information on the podcast, you can go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X. There's also an SQPN Discord server with a channel for Vatican II in a Year at sqpn.com/Discord.
Amen.